tonight. We are 6 o'clock start. We're going to go ahead and get started. As we typically do at Village Council meetings, we're going to begin this meeting with the Pledge of Allegiance. Rosa, would you please call a roll?
Mayor Barnett,
Here.
Commissioner Jose,
Here.
Commissioner Sadowski-Fugit,
Here.
Commissioner Gilmartin,
Here.
Commissioner Glover,
Here.
Commissioner Tully,
Here.
Commissioner Davenport,
Here.
Trustee Gagani. Here. Trustee Humphreys.
Here.
Trustee Kuntia.
Here.
Trustee Sladak.
Here.
Trustee Williams.
Here.
President Topic.
Here. Welcome, everyone. Good to see you. And welcome to the audience. Good to see you all as well. This is the second such meeting. We had one a little earlier to decide whether or not we wanted to have this one, frankly. So tonight we expect to make a little more progress on likely starting a subcommittee of some kind to do some further deliberation and study. Right now, what we're going to do is really start a dialogue. It's going to follow a little bit of an outline. Perhaps you've seen it. Some questions that we are, based on the last meeting, our staff helped us prepare really to facilitate this dialogue. I'm going to first just start with reminding all my colleagues that we want to try and talk, if possible, to each other. That's a little hard to do in a funky circle like this. But this is really a deliberation and a discussion, more than it is sort of a normal business meeting, if you will. We'll get to some of those at some point, but probably not tonight. Does anybody have anything in particular they want to say to start stuff off? Greg?
Thank you, Mayor. First off, I want to apologize for missing the last joint meeting. Everybody else in my house was down with a stomach bug, and I figured nobody else here really would want to take part in that. So I thought it best to skip. But I do appreciate the conversation and the collegiality that came out of that meeting. I think in that way it was very productive. I'm glad that we're meeting again to start to set the table for what this subcommittee is going to look like, or even, I guess, whether we're going to put it together. I'm assuming facts, not in evidence there, but I do think that a subcommittee is a good idea, and I think we have to be very careful about how we're going to put together the goals and objectives of it. We got to this sort of extraordinary process through a question that was posed by the village council that, depending on who you talk to, was kind of outside of its typical scope. Certainly not one that the village was able to really answer on its own. And that had to do with whether or not to have an elected board for the library. There were a lot of questions that go along with that, and that's kind of how we got here. So I think the primary focus should be to determine what facts are necessary in order to make an informed decision about that question, and then go about answering those facts and establishing those facts. If we go outside of that, if we're talking about the appointment power or the removal power or involvement in budget presentations at the village, these are all things that I think can and should be taken care of at an ordinary village council meeting on any typical Tuesday night. But when it comes to the question of an elected board, what are the pluses and minuses, the facts that are necessary to make an informed decision, that's something that I think deserves careful study and joint work with the library board of trustees and the village council. So for my part, that's what I'd like to see, along with the transparency necessary to make this a good public process. We should have the meetings in public, be obviously as collaborative as possible. We should have equal representation. But I think the scope should be fact-finding and deliver that information back to both bodies and allow each to do the work that it needs to once it receives those facts. Thank you, Mayor.
a matter of sort of procedure. If you haven't watched village council meetings, what we often do is sort of, everybody takes a minute to sort of tell where they stand on a series of questions. Those questions are on these sheets that I believe are on the table, right? Is that correct? No? Oh, man, okay, that's my bad. All right. We had, at our last meeting, had a lot of open-ended conversation that didn't end anywhere. And as a result of that, one of the things we charged our staff with doing was putting forward a series of questions that they thought encapsulated the ideas that were kind of battered around. Ideally, what we would then do at tonight's meeting is sort of talk through those questions. It may go other directions, other things certainly may come up, but the point of that is to try and get us to move in a direction that actually makes some progress of some kind. One of the things that's true certainly of 7 elected officials, and I suspect any other public servant, is if you just ask them a question, they can go on a lot of tangents. So what we're going to do tonight is, as Greg sort of just did, is start down and give everybody a chance to kind of react to those questions. I think everybody's got them at their space. And then what'll happen from that next is that we'll have heard things that each other has said. And there'll be something that Greg said that somebody else takes issue with. Or there'll be something that Swapna said that someone else takes issue with. But what we're trying to do ultimately is get a set of directionals so that our staff over there can take that information and help process what we're going to do next. Obviously, it's going to be to start a subcommittee, but when, where, who, what's the scope? Those are the kinds of things that we have to figure out and actually put some direction to tonight. So those questions are in front of us all, so if anybody else wants to sort of weigh in on those. Marty, go ahead.
I have kind of a point of order. This has been bugging me, so pardon me if it seems a little minor. Semantics.
Sure.
In my mind, it's kind of hard to have a subcommittee when you don't have a committee. And I've been kind of grabbing at the semantics of this, and if you're going to frame a project, to me, it's a task force or a fact-finding group or a working group or something that defines the mission more and more important than calling it a subcommittee when neither of us are really operating out of our typical committee structures.
You have a favorite name?
I've been referring to it as a task force, but that may not be it either. I just think it puts a little bit more official kind of stamp on it for the importance of the work that we're doing.
Sure. Good point. Anyone? Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, Mayor, I appreciate that. I just wanted to first say that unfortunately I have to leave early tonight, so in about, I don't know, maybe 45 minutes I'm going to have to take off for a family priority. So I agree. I think the subcommittee does lend itself to maybe we can look for a different name. I think addressing the first question about sort of the objectives and goals, I appreciate Commissioner Jose in his ideas of narrowing the scope, because I agree. I do think it's important. When I read sort of us looking at alternative selection models, it's not just looking, to me though, at whether it's an elected body or not. I think there are multiple models which we've discussed, and I think those should all be considered. I don't think it's that narrow to just simply talk about elected. And I think the other, and I'll pose it as a question, and then hopefully my colleagues here and our friends will share, but I'm curious to know if this is purely fact-finding, simply looking at how different models work. I've heard kind of the term pros and cons thrown around. That doesn't quite feel fact-finding. That feels like it has some subjectivity to it. But if the balance of this group would weigh in on sort of that idea of simply just pros and cons, pure data report back, or if there is a recommendation coming out of this, we'll say, task force. Because I think there is a big difference between those two. And I'm very curious as to what my colleagues think in terms of that. I will just share my thoughts. When I heard the idea of this looking at the phrase alternate ways, that led me down a path of improvement, thinking about improvement. And I was also on an ad hoc committee at one time, and the output of that committee was recommendations to the village council. And so I think maybe I had it framed in my mind that way. And so more clarity, more maybe thoughts from my colleagues here might help hone that a little bit better for me. Thank you, Mayor.
That's a good point. I'll remind everyone, at least of what we've said so far, which is to explore potential alternative approaches to selecting Library Board of Trustees. So to your point, Chris, it doesn't limit itself to A or B. There may be C, D, and E in that list. Anyone else want to jump in and either give their thoughts or react or comment on that? Martin?
Sure. Thank you, Mayor, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. Really glad to see you joining us, particularly early in a cold February. But at least we're not in January anymore, the longest month on record. I'm going to touch upon a number of things, and then I think we're all going to react to one another's comments. But I have thought about this as an ad hoc committee because in the history of the village, we have created lots of ad hoc committees. And the ad hocs can have specific missions which are fact-finding, and ad hocs can have missions which are fact-findings and recommendations. It's really whatever the village wants the ad hoc committee to do, because typically the ad hoc is for a specific purpose, and one of the things that we're here tonight, at least in my view, is to define what that specific purpose is. Clearly, as Commissioner Jose said and the mayor said, there was a big issue that brought this to where it is tonight. So I think that clearly has to be one of the issues, and I frame it as exploring what's possible, if you will, in terms of elected versus appointed. There have been some conversations about it, but I don't think we've really explored what's possible, and I think that's a question that should be answered. And that's what the ad hoc committee would do. So what we're really here to do tonight is to determine what is the composition of the ad hoc committee, setting a schedule for when that ad hoc committee should meet. I agree it's important to identify what is the ad hoc committee's mission or objective and what form is its work supposed to take when it's done. I think a schedule would be a good idea, just to keep things on track. I think starting as soon as practicable would be a good idea, since we have this wonderful momentum, and I would love to keep that momentum. So some of the thoughts I have on that is that, and I don't know if we're going through everything or if you want to come back to certain things, what's your pleasure?
No, I think like we typically do, Martin, just go as far as you want to go. There'll be a little back and forth. For the audience, this may seem a little awkward. This is what they sometimes refer to as sausage getting made. You've got 13 people up here who all think they know the answer to a half a dozen questions, and somehow we have to get all of us moving in the same direction. So part of that is just getting the conversation started and out there. Go ahead, Martin.
Thank you. So we can call it an ad hoc committee, and typically when we've created ad hoc committees before, we've chosen certain members to be on that ad hoc committee, and then we give it a mission. So I think those two things we need to do tonight. In my view, just what I think, and $4.50 will get you a cup of coffee, but in my view, the ad hoc should be no more than 2 members of each board, and the reason for that is, number one, and I will repeat this theme over and over again, is simplicity and being nimble. So 2, I think, makes a more efficient and nimble group. Number one, it's fewer people to schedule around. It's just easier for that group to meet and move forward. Number 2, 2 from each board allows those 2 people to speak in furtherance of the ad hoc committee's work. 3 then becomes more complicated because of requirements that we're all very familiar with. Number 3, in the past, and this isn't necessarily for ad hoc committees, but when the village council back in the days had standing committees for community events, I think Trustee Humphreys will remember this. Back in the days when we had standing committees, there were 2 members of the village council assigned to each of those standing committees. And again, nothing more magic than that than history. But that's sort of what I had in mind, is that it would be two representatives from each board, which obviously the boards can, you can decide who that is. I think that we ought to then figure out a schedule for regular meetings so we can keep progress. I know there were some dates that were thrown out in terms of when would there be some sort of conclusion or fact-finding or report or whatever the outcome is that we decided should be. I know last time we talked about September. Whether that's a magic date or not, I think it's good to have a date so that people can have something to work backwards from, and then we can talk about what it is that would be delivered to the public and to the village council in terms of what was explored, what was investigated, what was found. Yes, pros and cons. What are some advantages? What are disadvantages? I think previously there was discussion about what's pragmatic or feasible. I think those are important things to also explore in terms of what's possible. Some things could be very simple, some things could be very complicated, because I think what we all heard last time and leading up to last time is that there was a interest in the community having more information about this topic and more time to consider that information. So I think that's probably one of the main goals of the ad hoc committee is to gather information, to share information, and to get to a point where the committee says, okay, we could talk about this forever, but we think we've reached a reasonable point in which we can say we're going to pause, and here's what we found, and now what does the village council want to do? What does the community think? Where do we go from there? I think that the other thing I want to comment on, and then I will stop, but I have a lot of other things that I'm happy to jump in on, is the governance model for the committee. To me, it should be, and I know the word collaborative has been used, it certainly should be collaborative. Obviously, tonight is collaborative. But I think we really ought to focus on trying to achieve consensus, and consensus is not unanimous support, it's consensus. And that might be consensus on a set of facts. That might be consensus on here's some information about what's possible. And we ought to do that through dialogue and not debate. And what do I mean by that? Dialogue is listening to other people's viewpoints, trying to understand them, incorporating information that you learn from others into your own views, and it's an evolved, iterative process where hopefully you can reach consensus. And sometimes the consensus is you can't reach consensus, but consensus nonetheless. In contrast, debate is I have a position, I'm right and you're wrong, and we spend all our time trying to prove each other right or wrong, which I would like us not to try to do that, but instead explore what's possible, reach consensus, have a dialogue that the community can participate in and benefit from, and then see where we're at whatever the time period is that we choose is sort of oftentimes ad hoc committees will have a expiration date. I don't think we necessarily need to have an expiration date, but I think there ought to be some expectation of when the ad hoc committee would come to its objective, whatever that's defined to be. And then if there's a desire to have more time or new information is learned, then there always can be a conversation at any point in time along the way that either extends that or adds to that. So at a high level, those are kind of my thoughts on the questions that have been posed to us. And the other thing is, in furtherance of transparency, not only would the meetings be public, but I think it's really important that the two representatives from each board, during every regular meeting of the Library Board of Trustees or the Village Council, one of those two members would report out on sort of key takeaways. Nothing lengthy, 5 minutes or less, just sort of, here's what happened last time, here's what we expect to happen next time, just so that there's an additional layer of transparency and understanding of what the progress and the milestones have been. And then last, I do want to emphasize, I think that starting focused on what brought us all to this point is probably best, but that doesn't mean that as the committee does its work and as the Village Council and the Library Board of Trustees in conjunction with the public continue to have this dialogue, that we can't add or change things. There's nothing that says that we can't.
I'll grant you ad hoc committee with capital letters.
Look at that, consensus already.
Anyone want to weigh in over on this side of the table? Go ahead, Dave.
I hate to focus on too long on the logistics here, but is it a Is it an ad hoc committee of the village council, or is it an ad hoc committee of each of the two boards?
I think, in my mind, it's an ad hoc committee of the village council when we've asked, and I think you guys have asked for more participation in those conversations, and we wanted that to happen as well.
I can appreciate that, especially since, bottom line, other than state law, we don't have too much leverage on the, as far as, I mean, we are a municipal library, and you appoint us and so forth, and so I kind of appreciate that it probably is a ad hoc committee of the village council. As we, I think, as a group have said many times, we just want to be heard. We want to have input and be listened to.
Mike, you were,
Yeah, I've heard a lot that I agree with here. I really like the language in our, what items should be included in the report, particularly the idea attributes. So the goal of this group will be to explore the attributes of an appointed and elected library board based on existing research, analyzing options for consideration. And I'll end there because I'm not looking for recommendations at this point, right? I see this task force ad hoc committee, whatever it is, exploring these facts, this really being kind of step one. What's possible, right? How are things currently working? Some analysis of that, and then reporting back with that information. And then that group potentially being tasked yet again, if we want, to do more work or look at something in more depth, we could do that. So kind of in line with Martin's idea of a check back in as this is going along. Hopefully this work wouldn't take that long. I've said to a few of you before, in my world right here, this is awesome. We are 4 months ahead of the schedule I thought we would be on, is where we're at now. So this is terrific. Composition, I agree with 2 members each, and keeping it nimble, and the fact that this is a task at looking at the different attributes. I don't know that it needs to be a committee of the whole or a committee of more people than the 2 and 2 at this point. That could change as well, because it's in our purview to add more people to it if we wanted, if we feel it's necessary. So that's, yeah, and the dialogue emphasis, I really appreciate it as well, Martin. This is part of being heard, right? We have that dialogue and a common goal. So that's all I have for right now. Thank you.
on a timing thing, I'll go back to what we kicked off this process with. We talked about a goal of sometime starting in March and ending in September. And I think if we started, we probably can't pick a date today because we don't know the members and therefore don't know their availability. But if we said we were going to start in March, that gives, I think, your body and ours an opportunity to meet again to select who we send to such a thing. That September date, the reasoning behind that, at least initially, was to preserve the opportunity to use the next election as a referendum if the council felt the data provided drove them that way. So I still think that's an important thing to preserve. Remembering how we got here, there was, rightly or wrongly, a majority of the council that thought the referendum made sense. With public input, library requests, we've decided to do some more fact-finding and public education, which is entirely appropriate, but I think it's important to respect that. At least at one point, we were thinking a referendum was important, so September at least preserves that opportunity in the next cycle.
I agree.
Anyone else?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
just briefly, I think I agree with most all of that. I would just want to highlight that I hope that the group will appreciate that there are people that have significant expertise on these issues, who've studied these issues, and we may come in individually with thoughts about one thing sounds better than the other, but I hope we can all keep in mind that it's actually a lot more complicated than that, and there are people who have studied these questions, and one of my big hopes would be that the group will take advantage of that and bring people in to discuss those things from a position of expertise and listen and be humble about what we think we know, and be open-minded to the fact that what we think we know may be right, and it may not be, or there may be all kinds of blind spots that we don't realize we have until we have somebody address it. I think September makes sense. I think monthly meetings make sense. I think 2 and 2 makes sense. I think some kind of written product at the end. The line between recommendations and fact-finding, I think, might be a little bit blurry, but I think it does maybe make sense to leave it a little more on the fact-finding side. Here are the pros and cons, and I suspect that ultimately what this will come down to is which pros and which cons do people find to be more important than other pros and other cons. But hopefully we can get to more or less an agreed set of facts, and then, it's a decision kind of from there. Last point would be, I just want to reiterate again that I don't think this is an A or B situation, Mr. Mayor, as you I think agreed with. It could be appointed as it is. It could be appointed with changes to the appointment process. It could be elected. Even that could take a few different forms. So I think probably initially there should be just a sort of brainstorming what are even the options. And I just want to highlight again, I think that is broader than just A or B. And I think that's all I have.
Mayor?
So, hang on, just as a follow-up, when you were talking about expertise, it kind of registered in my head when we've used ad hoc in the past, some of those groups, social services and housing are 2 that come to mind. I think we've done just that. I think it's been important for the village to reach out beyond its own walls and get input. I would expect the same thing here. Chris?
Yeah, thank you. I think, so I agree with what's been said about the number of folks and some of that nuts and bolts stuff. It makes sense to me. This blurry line of recommendations and fact-finding, I think, is something that I would like to try to get a little more clarity out of here tonight. Because, with all due respect, Commissioner Tully, I'm not sure there's a consensus on facts. I think facts are facts. And I just feel like we need to understand where this committee ends. I personally think, Matt talked about appointment with maybe improvements, that type of thing. That is of interest to me. I'm not sure I've got a whole lot of you on here that agree with me, but I do think it's important that these folks who are spending the time, who are talking to the experts, will likely have some sort of understanding beyond what we know now that would lead to recommendations. I don't think receiving recommendations from this group in any way cedes our authority as a council. It essentially just gives us options. And I think that's kind of where the pros and cons sit and where the devil is in the detail. So it's important to me, it would be important to me that whether we're looking at elected, appointed, or 17 options in between, that the reason that we're looking at any of those options is that they're either better or worse than the current situation. So I also agree, and I'm trying to get my points across to you, I also agree that bringing in expertise from outside is a great idea, and I think this council should, and this group should commit to some kind of budget to do that. I don't think we have, I think we may have folks in town that can help, but I think there are likely experts that are gonna cost money, and I think it will shorten our path to, figuring this stuff out if we leverage those folks. So I would be in support of figuring out what kind of budget we need to apply to this as well.
Go ahead, Greg.
Thank you, Mayor. I agree on the budget point, and I wanted to return to that later, but thanks for putting that out there.
Mhm.
the experts and the analysis that I think we need will absolutely cost us something, and the question is what. I think we have to back up and think about exactly what the basic structure of this is going to be. If we're going to have an ad hoc committee of the village, I don't know why we would have anybody other than village council members on it. I think if we're having a joint committee, ad hoc committee, task force, call it what you want, but that is an exercise of both boards' powers. And if we're gonna put people on it, we have to vote to put people on it, and if they're gonna put people on it, they have to vote to put people on it. It doesn't just kinda happen, right? It's an exercise of our authority. By talking about things such as the appointment power or the removal power in a joint session, in my opinion, we are ceding authority. And I take that very seriously. Is that if we're staying with an appointed model, that is completely within the village's discretion. And any discussion outside of a village council meeting is a session of authority, and people will expect it in the future. And once power is gone, you can't get it back, or you do at a very high cost. And so I think we have to be careful about what we're doing. And I think asking the library to take, additional steps to cede a portion of their authority would be a misstep on our part as well. So I think we have to answer really what's the basic structure of this, number one, and number two, be incredibly careful about what we task it with, because if we're talking about the appointment power, we're talking about inviting in the folks that have been appointed to discuss how they should be appointed, limitations on how they might be removed. That doesn't seem to foster the right kind of conversation to me. I think that decreases rather than increases accountability. And it's counter to how I think any piece of government should be structured. So, when it comes to the structure, I think 2 and 2 is right, but I think it's a joint subcommittee. Talking about what do we need to know to determine what's possible with regard to an elected board. If we want to talk about changes to an appointed board, I'm all in favor of it. We can talk about more transparency. We can talk about increasing or decreasing the number of candidates that are considered. We can talk about any or all of this, but it should happen on a Tuesday night at 7 o'clock under a new business item or something else on our agenda. That's when those conversations should take place. If we're talking about what do we need to know to get informed on how to get to an elected board, or whether we want to ask a question related to getting to an elected board, that's something that this joint committee would be uniquely situated and empowered to do.
Yeah, I would just add, I think, going back to my ad hoc committee experience, we did come back with a ton of recommendations.
Because that's how it was set up. That was the ask.
But if I knew or thought it wasn't my responsibility, or that none of it was going to be, or if I thought that I had the responsibility of enacting that, I think it would be a lot different. I think the idea is that we're looking for recommendations. From my perspective, you keep mentioning this elected board. That is not the only option. So I guess I want maybe more clarity from you. Are you only looking at this subcommittee to look at whether it should be elected or not? Or are you looking for the additional options, appointed with recommendations, elected but still part of as a subcomponent? Like, are those all on the table? I'm literally just trying to get clarity of what.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, and this goes to your comment earlier about the line gets blurred between recommendations and fact-finding. In terms of this subcommittee, should it be empowered? I think the question is, what are the options in terms of an elected board? What are the facts we need in order to determine whether or not that's a good idea? It's laying out the facts.
But a
so
good
that
idea is inherent
hang on.
to recommendations. I think.
Well, the facts are inherent, and we can draw conclusions based on those facts. If we want to talk about changes to the appointment power, we don't need to be here. That can happen any Tuesday night. So if we want to talk about changes to the appointment power, let's go talk about it. Put it on an agenda. I can talk all night.
Going back, guys, to how we got here maybe is worth at least repeating. It was largely in response to a feeling that was broad within the council, within the library, I think, and certainly within the public, of a lack of understanding and lack of time to consider this potential change. And so my sense of the goal of this group, which is why Matt and I worked this out at the beginning, was to understand what those possible paths to selecting trustees are. And that's why, Chris, I agree with you. I don't think it's two. I don't think it's A and B. But understanding what they are, taking input from experts on the value, pros and cons of those various possible methods, is going to take some time, and it's going to take some work. And that's what I see. That's what I see this committee doing. I see it ending with a report to the council that provides all that information. And you know, just like our meetings, if the committee has got an expert in and is listening to their input, that's going to generate questions that none of us sitting here even know right now, right? There's a real value to that part of the process. But then at the end, the village council is going to receive this information, and two things will have happened. The village council and the library board will have gotten a lot more educated on the choices. The public will have that information available to them, plus we'll have had the opportunity to participate and witness those conversations and those meetings, those discussions. But I don't know that there's any particular next step after that, right? It gets the public and the boards to a higher degree of understanding about options and pluses and minuses. Council may or may not decide to do anything with that information, just like any other ad hoc group or subcommittee we put out there. Martin?
To speak to Commissioner Jose's point about the structure, I see that a little bit differently. I see an ad hoc committee of the village council to be one where we have representatives on it, but as in the past, we can appoint other members from other boards and commissions. We've done it with planning issues. We've done it with parking issues. We've done it with a lot of issues. I view it as, and it's probably the most, again, simple and efficient way to do it, is to set it up as an ad hoc committee established by the village council. We've invited 2 members from the Downers Grove Board of Trustees to participate as individuals who have unique information and experience on the topic who can contribute. They can always decline. We can't make them, but we're inviting them in the spirit of this cooperation and dialogue to participate. And so I don't think that cedes anyone's authority. I think that the village council has always set up ad hoc committees and said, here's what they're going to be comprised of, here's what your mission is, here's what your timetable is, and here's what your end result is, which we can continue to talk about what that looks like, because it has differed. There have been some ad hocs which have been I want recommendations on these 3 things. Other times it's, we really just want you to engage more broadly with the public on this topic, and then bring all that back to us without any concrete recommendations. That's for the council to decide. But I also think setting it up that way doesn't cede any power or any responsibility to the Library Board of Trustees. They have been invited to participate as appointed members of the ad hoc committee to share in 2 different directions. Number 1, to share their broader knowledge, experience, and understanding as part of the conversation, which I think everyone was very interested in continuing, but also the ability to share that back with the rest of their board and others in the community, so that we have sort of double transparency, because we're all talking about it. So I don't see a problem with setting it up as an ad hoc committee and treating it as such. I don't think it interferes with our ability to manage our affairs, or the Library Board of Trustees to manage their affairs. I do agree with you, Commissioner, that if we get too deep into the appointment process generally, then I think we need to be careful, which is also why I would like to start small, keep it simple, small steps, because this isn't the only board or commission that we appoint people to. And if we're going to have a broader conversation about changing of selection, recruitment, appointment, and all that other stuff, there's, by my count, at least a dozen other boards and commissions that might be interested in that conversation. And I do think that should be solely the province of the village council. And if we want to have that broader conversation, then we ought to take it up as either part of our own governance, or we ought to take it up as part of a high priority action item, or however the village council wants to do it. And we've done that periodically, revisited the whole appointment process generally for all the boards and commissions. Yes, I understand and fully respect and embrace that the Library Board of Trustees has a unique standing amongst our board and commissions, but there are other boards and commissions that we go through a similar process to identify and appoint. So that's why I would not want to try to, with all due respect, in one little bucket, try to address things that have a broader impact. So that point I agree with you. And then last but not least, I agree, Commissioner, that you don't have to have consensus on facts. What I mean is that a consensus in terms of what the report and the outcome will look like. What I would not like to see is a vote that includes concurring and dissenting opinions. I think that's not in the spirit of what I have in mind. I would think there would be consensus about what is presented, not necessarily that one person thinks their facts are different than the others. There's an old saying, is you're entitled to your opinion, but not to your own facts. But there are also opinions on trade-offs. So the facts can be the same, but someone might value those facts differently. So when I say consensus, I mean in terms of if what is presented at the end of the day, that everyone can do that without saying, I don't have to necessarily agree with every single drop of ink on this page, but I think this fairly represents the work of the ad hoc committee. That's what I meant.
Martin, could I ask you about the ad hocs in the past? And I'm unaware of any ad hoc committees involving village council members, but so they're before my time at the very least. So could you enlighten me?
Well, like I said, we had standing committees, which were standing committees, so by their very nature, Marty, we're not ad hoc, because the standing committee is not ad hoc. But
right, those were eliminated 8-10 years ago while you were mayor.
Correct. And the reason why they existed was because there there's always been three, but those two committees had, at the time, some kind of budget impact. It was primarily community grants and community events. Back when we had a community grant program. Right. So the standing committee was eliminated when the program was eliminated. And the other one was community events, which used to have a much bigger role in terms of recommending and committing to the village things like Heritage Festival before it was operated by, before it was Rotary Fest. So because those two boards, those two committees, standing committees of the village had arguably budget input, it was thought that there should be 2 members of the village council on each of those standing committees. All I'm saying is that while the names are different, standing versus ad hoc, because ad hoc obviously is ad hoc, the concept is not new, of having village council members as part of those. And the rationale for it back then was, as mentioned, was because there was some perceived budget impact by those 2 committees. Those were eliminated because their ability to impact the budget went away. So there was no reason to have the standing committees anymore. And no reason to have village council members sit on those committees. So I'm just viewing it from that lens, as I think that worked well. There's some precedent for it. I think having 2 was good, but setting it up as an ad hoc, I think, is something that is squarely within the authority of the village council. We can put on it whoever we want, and you know, at least again, my viewpoint is that we're inviting 2 members of the Library Board of Trustees to serve on that ad hoc committee, to further the dialogue, to further transparency, and hopefully reach consensus, but also to have the benefit of, as President Topic said, more information that can evolve all of our thinking on the subject.
Leslie, please.
Yeah, just trying to get my thoughts together. I came in with some thoughts, but as I listen, kind of shifting back and forth and just trying to figure out how I want to say everything. I do agree that I think our main focus should be on the options that we have, whether it be elected or appointed. I think there can be kind of some small tweaks we could even be looking at in that appointed area, and I agree with Commissioner Tully there that I think there are some things that we can identify there that could be improved. But I think that part of the reason why we got here was a real desire to improve the working relationship between the village council and the library board of trustees. And so if the only objective that we have is to look at elected versus appointed, I'm not quite sure how that is improving our relationship with the library board of trustees. To me, there needs to be some sort of an objective, whether it be aligning our governance structures, There needs to be something here to help improve that relationship, but there's not a whole lot that I'm hearing up here that is leading to any sort of an improved relationship. I'm trying to find a good word for it, but I'm not finding a good one. But the speech is almost very controlling, and targeted at, all right, this is what we're going to do, and of course we are council, and of course we have, the power to appoint. But again, part of this was to improve that relationship, and right now I'm not quite sure how we're doing so with the conversation that we're having. So I do understand the rationale between having 2 and 2. It does simplify things from the OMA perspective, and we're not making policy with only 2 people versus 3. I get that, and I can live with that. If we're going to do that, then I would say I think we need to have this be a fact-finding and not a recommendation, because if we really only are having 2 people, then we really shouldn't be making a recommendation and forming policy with only 2 people on this ad hoc committee. So I am in favor of making this a fact-finding mission, but I would like us to think a little bit about that other piece of it of being collaborative, allowing us to be equally represented, and figuring out how we can make this process help us to repair that relationship that I think partially got us here in the first place. So I don't know if there's anyone else that would like to talk about whether it be aligning our governance procedures or whatever it may be, but I think there's some benefit there to having some conversation in this committee so that we can align ourselves a little bit better and move forward in a more constructive way. Thank you, Mayor.
Mike?
Can I just?
Oh, geez, I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Mike, I have this bad habit. I'm sorry. You guys need to
Where are we
yell,
going?
hey, Bob. Marty, you want, please.
Let's say we have something, can we call it a joint village committee on library governance, or whatever we come up with on it. I really see a parallel process here. I appreciate what Commissioner Jose said about the scope of it has to be fairly focused. I don't see on a practical basis, when you kind of get into doing that, how you can completely separate out the appointment process from it. But there will be short-term and longer-term things going on with this. There's nothing that would prohibit the village council, if something comes up during these deliberations that indicates something needs to be changed on the current process, that's your job. You can do it. The committee or task force or whatever we're calling it can go back to you and say, in the meantime, let's try to get something fixed with X, Y, or Z. Because no matter what the outcome of this is, facts, recommendations, referenda, any changes are going to take a longer time to implement, particularly if it ends up in also needing a referendum. There's nothing that prohibits the council from improving the appointment process in the meantime, because we are likely to have, some openings come up before all of this is done. So they're not mutually exclusive.
I think Greg was alluding to something similar along those lines, Marty. I agree with you. It's a parallel thing, and the council can start a discussion on any of those types of things at any time. I think if I understood Commissioner Jose right, it's that those types of things that, such as Leslie was alluding to, I think in Greg's mind, and I tend to agree with, are probably best suited from the council itself, which could happen parallel, could happen anytime. Dave, were you want to jump in?
Yeah, just just a couple of things. First of all, as my experience with, I hate these words, Robert's Rules of Order, that I'm not sure either of us are totally bound by, and nobody should be. Even Robert says that you can deviate, but an ad hoc committee can very frequently and easily be appointed by the village council and also acknowledged perhaps by the Library Board of Trustees, but it does not, you know, an ad hoc committee can include members of the appointing committee, like the village council, for example, and also members of the public. The point is, I think, in that kind of a committee, an ad hoc committee, is once the committee is appointed, all of the members of the committee are kind of on equal ground within the committee. And deciding how the committee is going to work, and so if it obviously get too far out of bounds, the appointing committee can rein it in. But normally within the committee, all the members are on equal footing and can decide who to invite and what kinds of things to discuss within the charge that has been given. And if the decision is made to make a recommendation, the committee makes a recommendation. The committee doesn't make any laws. They make recommendations or deliver facts or whatever, but the committee as a whole determines what that part is, and they return that information to the governing body that makes whatever decisions need to be made. So, just wanted to clarify that. I would want, whoever appoints the committee, both the village council members and the library board members will want to be full members of the committee. As far as, I heard the word repair, which troubles me just a little bit. I think that one of the things that the library board is looking for to discuss in this committee, either as a principal part of the charge or at least a side discussion, is what needs repairing. In other words, what are the what has contributed, what are the components of this breakdown that we've been hearing about? Because I don't think the library board felt as strongly as the village council did that there was a breakdown in communication. We're eager to discuss it, but so I would not want to see that excluded from the committee discussion. But one of the outputs of the committee discussion will be obviously an improvement in communication. So.
Mayor, can I need to run, if I just.
Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
Sorry, Mike, I know you were next, I apologize, but I do need to run. So just a couple things. I think first, if there are examples of reports that we've done historically that have been fact-finding, I would love to see an example. So if staff can find something like that, that might give me better context of maybe what some of the expectations are for purely a fact-finding committee. And then I would also just ask, because I have to leave, that staff would I'll maybe provide some additional comments based on what is said after I see the rest of you. And I do apologize for leaving, and thank everybody for coming. Thank you.
Thanks for being here, Chris. That was tight, I know. Mike, were you wanting to jump in?
This is a tremendous opportunity to get input from the folks that we appoint. I mean, they know better than I do about the work that they're doing. I'm one of the people charged with making appointments. And so gathering up information about the process, the attributes of an appointed and elected board is going to be helpful to me in performing my obligation here to basically make a decision, cast a vote to do one thing versus another. So, and who better to ask about how to make improvements than the folks that have been doing the work. As well, if we're going to move towards an elected body in some way, shape, or form, that's best done with an agreement amongst all of us, that we all agree that that's in the best interests. And if we can't do that, then if we decide not to, I have additional thoughts on things that might need to be addressed. But if think this is a multi-step process, as I was sharing before. And the first thing I think we're all agreeing on, I'm not hearing any disagreement on the idea that we need to gather up more information. And we can talk all day about what's next, but I think that from the sake of moving forward, it'd be nice if we just kind of came to that agreement and agree that we can revisit if we want to expand the task, if we want them to look at something more in depth, we can do that. But right now, it's about deciding on the composition, the schedule, and this immediate work that they need to do, right? And I'm hearing a fair amount of agreement on those things. So and what we call it, I could care less, you know? So, like things to move along here.
Greg? Thank you, Mayor. Part of the reason why this is, I think, at least somewhat more difficult, at least in my view, is that, you know, we typically do things as a committee of the whole. Even with guiding DG, we didn't put together another ad hoc committee to study this, that, or the other thing. We're literally picking out what street segments downtown are gonna look like, and we're doing it together. When you're creating a subcommittee, or a committee, or an ad hoc, or you put whatever name on it you want, you're inherently ceding power. That's an extent, you're taking your authority to analyze this issue, gather facts on it, and you're giving it to somebody else. That's not how we've done business the last 12 to 15 years. You know, were there standing committees? Yes. They met a grand total of no times in the time I've been up on the dais. So I take your point. But even then, what you were doing was, through the persons of those two village council members, extending authority to additional people. I think Trustee Humphreys hit it exactly on the head. Once everybody's on that committee, they expect to be equal. Of course they should be, because what we're talking about is gathering the information that's necessary to answer the questions that ultimately brought us here in the first place. That was, you know, as we talked about for weeks, and I mean, it was one of the principal things I talked about. I don't have enough information. I need to know what the financial impact is. I need to know what the potential elected structures look like. I need to know how we go from one to the other if that decision gets made. All of those have absolutely nothing to do with an appointment power or removal power. They have nothing to do with increasing the communication between the boards, although I think that's a legitimate thing to talk about in terms of this ad hoc committee. We could talk about ways to improve communication between the boards, to align budget processes, things like that. I think that's all legitimate, but that all requires a willingness from the library to put their power into the committee as well, because their budget is their budget. And that's been one of the sticking points for at least some folks up on the dais as long as I've been around. We have to, I think, focus this very narrowly and determine exactly what we want answered, because the subcommittee is, by definition, being granted a certain amount of authority. There's just no way around it. And if we're talking about recommendations, that authority only increases. So
I agree with everything except that we're ceding any authority. I just don't understand why it's ceding an authority. The village has created ad hoc committees and joint committees for land use issues, for liquor issues, for parking issues, for all kinds of issues, and simply said, go look at this issue. Here's what we'd like you to go do, and bring back some recommendations. It does not change the fact that it is a recommending board.
I'll put it really bluntly.
So it's not ceding any authority. The question, though, is what you're really getting at, and this is where I think the structure is less important than the substance, which is, what are you expecting them to deliver?
I'm expecting them to deliver facts and analysis. But let me go back to your original question. And I mean no offense to any of the folks here to my right. You're all doing a great job. But if we're talking about changes to the appointment power, there's folks over here whose terms are going to expire at some point. So we're going to ask them how we ought to appoint them. I don't think that's the proper way to do it. I don't think that's the proper question to ask. You don't go to somebody and say, how do I give you this job?
but that's where I'm separating out, what is it that they're talking about as opposed to the structure of the committee? I don't see any ceding of power in the structure of the ad hoc committee. Where I think you're making a point, and I want to make your point for you, is that if you ask them to come back with too broad of topics, then you might be, and by the way, remember earlier on, I said, if it talks about, if we're talking about broader identification, selection, vetting, and appointment, that's a village council question.
Thank you.
Because we have a whole bunch of other boards and commissions that we have the same process for, and it's not unique to the Library Board of Trustees. So the narrow is what I'm agreeing with you on, but I'm saying if we keep it narrow, and that doesn't mean we can't add things such as, I mean, we're improving our communications right now. It doesn't mean we can't add other things, but if we keep it narrow, then we're not ceding anything, we're not even getting into that issue, but I don't see simply setting up an ad hoc committee ceding any authority at all, because we do it all the time. And it's just it's an important recommending board that brings back a defined deliverable, which then the village council can act upon, no different than any other recommending board that we have and that we get reports from every single Tuesday. But the difference is it allows for a broader conversation, a more specialized conversation involving more people and more input and more transparency than perhaps the village council alone could factor into its Tuesday night schedule. That doesn't cede any power at all.
So I think that
let me take a
depends
run at
on the
Bridget.
scope of the, give me
Yeah.
2 more
Yes.
seconds. It depends on the scope of the
Right.
question being asked.
Yes.
That's
That's
my
where I'm
point.
I agree with you on that.
And that's where I'm headed, scope. So I took a run at just some verbiage to try and get to where maybe we had something everybody could nod their heads to. So looking back to how we got here, what I was suggesting that this is kind of under the category of what should be included in the report, right? Possible models of selecting library trustees and the processes required to achieve each. Pluses and minuses of each process. That's, in my mind, that's it. And I think if that was it, then I think it avoids, if that is your scope, and because the idea is to bring a set of data points back to the village council, it avoids some of these concerns about authority cession. It also is in keeping with, I think, how we got here. That's not to say there aren't 13 times 5 more possible subjects for us all to talk about. But how we got here to this point for the meeting in January, this meeting now, that was the scope.
Yeah, I'm getting, maybe I'm getting a little confused on some of the points here. I think it's really important that this group be able to discuss a sort of third potential option, because we have elected and we have the existing appointment process. And I take the point that the council sets the appointment process, and I understand sort of theoretical concerns about ceding power. But I think if you don't allow the group to explore the possibility of at least big picture, not down in the weeds, but big picture kind of, maybe another way to do the appointment process that very well might achieve what some of the goals are for having an elected board, but without some of the downsides of having an elected board. I really think it would not, this group would not be doing all that it could be doing if it wasn't permitted to explore that option. And I understand there's other boards and commissions. Respectfully, I think we're a very different entity than other boards and commissions, and that is part of the reason why there was talk about potentially making us an elected board. So I get that point, but I think the value of the work of the group, if it's not allowed to, at least at a macro level, look at kind of a third, maybe there's a fourth, whatever, but sort of not dictating the finer points of that, but just to note that there may be a way to do an appointment process that gives you the benefits of an elected board. I think it's important that the group be able to explore that.
My hope would be that some of that stuff would come out in the pluses and minuses discussions. And I think that's different. I would argue that's a natural part of the discussion that is different than recommending a change to us of our existing process. I don't know if that's making any sense. But it's, and I think it's also still important to remember this isn't likely an A or B kind of a thing. This is likely an A, B, C, D kind of a thing. And each one of those, when we're looking at when this subcommittee or ad hoc committee or whatever we're gonna call them is looking at item C, there's gonna be a discussion. And that's gonna come with pluses, minuses, likely outside input. All of that's just gonna be bundled up in something that the council will then review. And you know, then at that point, the council will have the authority to do whatever it wants with that information. I think that's different than making a recommendation to us to change something about an existing process. I think there's a distinction there. Marty?
Dave was talking about being listened to, and, you know, we've gotten to know each other a lot better through this process already, one-on-one, which has been great. There's really nothing that prohibits any council member from approaching any one of us, and particularly the last 3 appointees who went through the new process, and saying, what can you tell me about what your reaction is? What could we be doing differently? You know, that can be done informally, or it can be done formally. It can be done as part of this ad hoc effort, or it can be done as part of the purview of the council. And these are not all mutually exclusive kinds of things. We're all about wanting to improve the ultimate outcome of library governance for the benefit of the community. And if that means we can make some immediate changes, that's fine. We're very happy to work with you on that.
Yeah,
Yeah, go ahead.
okay, I have, this is sort of a very hyper-specific question, is I think it should be made clear to the group whether the possibility of a library district is a thing that they are to be looking at. Because when we talk about having an elected board, you could accomplish that by creating a district. You could accomplish that by going to Springfield and changing the law to allow the same entity to be elected. I'm not trying to jump ahead, that's what the group will be looking at, but coming in, that's kind of my basic understanding of it. So I think that would be a good thing to define, is if the group is going to consider a district as another option, that's a whole other set of considerations. If that is not something that the council wants the group to be considering as an option, that's perfectly fine. But I'm wondering if it might make sense to get some clarity on that.
I'll ask for a comment from all my colleagues on that. From my perspective, that is one of the possible processes, and it would have with it some pluses and minuses. In my mind, the council's gonna end up with a stack of data. And we may or may not do anything with any of that. Martin?
Yeah, I mean, I just go back to what we've all been saying, which
Yeah.
is exploring what's possible.
Right.
And just to be, you said it very well earlier, President Topic, is that let's not all go into this thinking we know what we know. Let's go into
Right.
it and actually find out what we should know. I guarantee you that our thinking will evolve. My thinking has evolved all throughout this process, and I expect it will continue to evolve. But I don't want to come into it saying, well, I think I know everything about this subject. You know, when's the meeting over? We should really explore what's possible, and we may find out, yeah, you know, now I know. Everything's just fine. Back to the way we were. Or we may come into it and say, wow, I didn't know that. And maybe that's something I'd be interested in, although, wow, it's very difficult, and I'm not so sure I want to pursue it. But I want to take you at what you said earlier about let's not go in thinking we already know everything there is to know, but let's explore what's possible. So I wouldn't say that there's something that we're definitely not talking about this. But I view it as less of a, no, we've got to explore that as an option, as more of a, what is that option? That's what I have in mind in terms of exploring what's possible. And then that's part of the information that comes back is, okay, this is, and you know, we've been talking about 3, there might be 4, there might be 5. I'm not confident that what's possible has been fully explored. And I think that's a question that deserves an answer. I think there are people that would like to know, I mean, what is the universe of possibility? And then, I mean, we're doing this as a village council on other topics right now. That doesn't mean we're going to do them all, but we want to understand, and we want the community to understand what is possible, and then we can make some informed decisions as a community. So that was a very long answer to a short question.
Mike?
I just want to say that, you know, I instigated all this by asking a question. My process in my professional life, I don't show up at people's homes and start sketching out all different possibilities of what they could do with their house. had a professor in college that used to say, start with the known facts. And I can't, until I know what those facts are, it's hard for me to start visualizing what could possibly be, right? And so this process has to be, yes, there should be some commentary on a separate library district and the pros and cons of that. My experience has been throughout my career is that once you identify all those possibilities, what's possible, that certain solutions start to kind of rise to the top. It's almost obvious. Sometimes I say the house almost designs itself with some of the things that we do, and with additions and such. So I see this process in much the same way. I think that by looking, you threw out the library district. There may be other things that none of us up here have even thought about yet, right? And I would hope that this group would dig into things in a way to identify all those different twists and turns, what's happened in we're not reinventing the wheel here. There's, throughout the state, throughout the country, there's all kinds of models and things that have happened and ways of going about this. So I love the notion that there might be have your cake and eat it too sort of solution to this. Seemed like a real win for everybody in that case. So, but the first, the goal here is for this group to identify all the different attributes, find out what the different possibilities are, identify those attributes, bring them back to us, and then we'll decide what to do with it, right? And I'm hearing, once again, great consensus on that, I think, and so I'm not sure what our next step is, Mayor, but it sounds to me like we're wrapping it up.
I'm going to recap, but before I do that, does anybody want to jump in with anything to particularly add? You, or you want me to recap? I'm working back from the sheet that we all got a circulation of earlier, and I think the goals and objectives of the project, which is really pretty closely tied to what should go in the report, is a review of what's possible in terms of methods of electing, or not electing, of selecting library board trustees, and then some list of pluses and minuses of what those are. I think that's what we're expecting to get as a council. I think the project schedule is March through September. I think we're thinking the working group should be 2 and 2 from members of the council and members of the library board. And I think from a governance model, I think we've not talked a lot about that, which probably means we're sort of thinking everything that's down here makes sense. I don't know if anybody had anything. That seems like one that I at least didn't get a lot of notes on. Did anybody have any particular things? Let me add a few. Just simply, these are, talk about boring, but we talked a little bit about monthly meetings. Meeting in council chambers, I think it makes sense because it provides a forum that's pretty easy to facilitate such meetings, include the public. Sure. There needs to be a chairperson, some village staff and some library staff at each meeting. Minutes should be taken, approved, and circulated in kind of typical fashion that we all do our meetings in. And then I think it was mentioned earlier, a couple different folks said it, but I think that the members of this board should appear on future council and library board agendas as sort of report outs and opportunities to have some additional sort of expanded two-directional as it goes. And I think, if we think we want to improve communication, there's probably going to be a whole lot of it that comes through this, I suspect. So does anybody think I'm missing something or misrepresenting something, or Dave? Yeah, go ahead.
Just a comment. I think you hit on a very important part to remind us that every month, I think, both boards are going to hear from their representatives on this ad hoc committee about what's going on. And that's not a one-way report necessarily. Right. If either of our boards, or both, feel that the committee, the ad hoc committee, is off the rails, either of the boards can send not a directive, that's too strong a word perhaps, but some information back to the committee that suggests get back on the rails. Or find a third rail. That's a bad analogy.
That's a bad one.
Not a third rail. Find another rail that, in order to keep both boards on board with what's going on in the committee.
Anyone else? All right, first question, team of 8, 7, sitting over there. Do you guys feel like you've got enough? I think we'd be looking for, a couple of opportunities at each of our meetings to select people and then get that group together. Do you guys feel like you have enough information to head down that road? Just imagine if we could work a
The
mic.
village staff team does. There's 2 on-off buttons on this microphone, in all fairness, Mayor. So yes, we do have direction, review possible methods of selecting library board of trustees with attributes of those methods, all the other information you said. We have good direction there.
Julie, I'm seeing you nodding. You feel good about it too? Okay, good. Thank you. At a public meeting, we try to still take an opportunity, even though this is a little bit boring and long, and we do want to make some progress, but we do want to hear from the public. If you've got some things to say, come down to the microphone. We'd like to try and remember a couple of things. First of all, what you just heard is clearly not any kind of final decision. There's going to be 6 to 8 more such meetings that'll all be available to the public. And so respect the idea that 3-4 minutes probably makes a lot of sense, and there's going to be plenty of opportunity coming up. So come on down.
Good evening, Kylie Spurn, Downers Grove resident. I would like to give a brief history on the village appointment process for boards and commissions, with a specific focus on our library. The Illinois Library Act states that for libraries established under the commissioner form of local government, the council shall appoint the library trustees. There are no other conditions or guidelines in state law regarding the appointment process. In the 1970s, Mayor Hawke created an informal verbal policy on the council's appointment process for village boards and commissions. The mayor selected a commissioner to the position of liaison. The liaison was responsible for vetting, shortlisting, and presenting a candidate to the mayor for nomination. Once nominated by the mayor, the council confirmed the appointment. It worked well for 20 years. During the Madonna book banning of the early 1990s, this verbal policy was challenged by residents on both sides of the book banning issue. In fact, in 1993, there was a petition by those trying to ban books in our community. The petition was to create a referendum on the ballot for an elected library board. Those petition signatures, 60 of them turned out to be fraudulent, and the petition was thrown out. In 1994, under Mayor Betty Sheaver's leadership, that policy was put into writing and adopted as the village council policy regarding appointments to the boards and commissions. I wasn't sure if you had seen this document, so I made a copy for everybody. Mayor Sheaver valued process, fairness, and recruiting the best candidates for boards and commissions, while protecting the integrity and identity of applicants. This 30-year-old policy is a very good policy. It established profile sheets that are valid for 2 years. It allowed applicants to be specific in their wish to serve on a particular board or commission. It outlined the solicitation of applicants and the village manager's role in attracting candidates. But most importantly, it lists the vetting process of candidates. It created a council liaison to all boards and commissions responsible for reviewing profile sheets, interviewing candidates, creating shortlists, and submitting a recommendation report to council. This policy clarified the nomination, appointment, and reappointment processes. But there is a Section 7 that states, this policy is intended to be a non-binding general guideline for considering appointments to the village boards and commissions. This official policy worked until it didn't work when mayors went rogue. I won't rehash those details. A positive outcome of one of those issues was a change in the vetting process when Trustee Sladek was appointed to the Library Board. To my knowledge, and please correct me if I'm wrong, these changes were never made official in writing. What I want to stress is that you already have an appointment policy. It needs some tweaking to bring it into the 21st century, but you have this framework that worked for 30 years. Way too much time and resources will be spent if we keep having discussions about having discussions. You have the official policy, you have a framework for all village board and commission appointments. Update it, amend the policy with a proposed resolution, allow the public to weigh in, review and revise as needed, then vote on the resolution to make it official village policy. Commissioners and Mayor, this is not a library issue, it is a village council issue. You already have the framework to make positive and transparent change to the village board and commission appointment process. Please use it. Thank you.
Good evening. Eileen Brainer. It was stated tonight, and I think incorrectly stated, that there was a breakdown between the village council and the library board. Partially correct. There was a breakdown between citizens, the village council, and the library board. The citizens want input and transparency in the process, whatever process is chosen. I think your ad hoc committee is a good idea. It's lacking in one thing: citizen input. I think you need 1 or 2 citizens on that ad hoc committee as well. A citizen who's been involved, knows what's going on, knows what the concerns of the citizens are, in order to get complete consensus between the village and the boards. It's time to put citizens into this picture. And as just a side note, I know this process will not be completed by August, but I'd like a temporary change for our August appointments to the library board, of which there will be 2, which is a third of the board, that will be appointed in September. And as a citizen, I would like to see some transparency in that decision-making process for a third of the board in 2025. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Laura Hoyce. I'm a 39-year resident of Downers Grove. I spoke at the last meeting, and I'd like to address what Chick Briner just said. Is my impression exactly that there's been a lot of discussion tonight, but not enough recognition of what brought us here, what are the issues, and those of us that have been involved in village council meetings and school board meetings and library meetings for several years are well versed on these issues, and it's critically important that you listen to and obtain input from us, the citizens and residents of Downers Grove, that care deeply about our community and want this situation improved. We have not been heard, and I so appreciate you giving us the opportunity to speak tonight about exactly what we need, which is respect for the taxpayer. This is our library in Downers Grove. Input from the taxpayers and recognition that both of these boards work for us. And if we can get to that point, we'll definitely have a better chance of achieving consensus. Whether or not this council will allow resident input through participation on the committee, or whether you will review seriously the comprehensive input we've already provided to you through the e-remark system. 17 of us
collaborated and provided you with a really comprehensive feedback on what brought us here, what went wrong. I've been here for 39 years, and it was in 2020 when things started going off the rails. And it wasn't just locally, it was nationally. But that's when this library became a political activist library for the radical left. That's when we had pornography injected, that's when we had school indoctrination, that's where we had the library aligning with the schools, that's where we had parental rights concerns, that's where we had children's innocence concerns. There were all types of opportunities for feedback, and we have been active in providing input for years now. We have a breadth of knowledge, and we'd love to share it with you, and we already have shared much of it. So the objectives and goals, as I see them, regardless of whether it's an ad hoc committee or a village council controlled committee, because I see the points made on both sides, the objective is to have a neutral institution again. It's really not that complicated. Let's go back to pre-2020. I was here for 35 years. I raised 4 children in this community. I was at the library all the time. I used to love the library. But starting in 2020, when these elements were injected and we were being told what to think and what books we were allowed, you know, to have, how the curating was done, everything changed. And that's why many of us in the community became active in expressing our concerns. So expertise from the outside, I'm concerned about that idea, not because of what it would cost, but because of what we've experienced with the RGW report, the library, that's still readily available to anyone that wants to review it. That is not the type of expertise we needed back in 2020 through the present. That is not what supports families, that's not what supports pro-America, that's not what supports our First Amendment right to speak, or our ability to make our own decisions and not be told what the library's position is on various political views. This all changed, and we've witnessed it, and we want you to understand well that this is our community. We need and must provide input, and we're pleading with you to look at what we've already provided as far as feedback on what are the concerns, in particular about the Downers Grove Public Library, how it has changed so drastically from the first 30-plus years I lived here to the last 5 years. If we can bring it back to a neutral institution, that should be the goal, and through every step, community input should be obtained. And the boards need to be balanced. They need balanced perspectives by members of the community that include conservative, Christian, God-fearing. Those that think differently need to be on the same board so that we can have that consensus and we can have full dialogue toward what we're really interested in, which is unity, which is bringing our families back together, bringing mutual respect for each other in the community. And one final point I will make is that in selecting those to be on the ad hoc committee, I noticed that at the last Downers Grove Public Library meeting, 2 of the board members expressly stated their intention to keep on doing DEI. All of you are aware of what's been happening nationally with the new administration coming in. Those are the members that we don't need to provide input on where we need to go from here. And thank you so much for allowing me to speak tonight.
Hi, Ed Polak, Downers Grove resident. Just a very simple comment. We're talking about this as an ad hoc committee. I think one of the things that caused this discussion, causing things here, I heard from many people on the village council that there was a lack of communication with people on the library board, and it seemed like coming together like this has been a big improvement. So I think this is kind of assuming the conclusion that, or assuming, arguing the assumption that changing the appointment process is all that's needed to be done. I think some of the disagreements I heard had to do more with things like, policy and budgets, and I don't know that changing the appointment process necessarily fixes all of that or is the final solution for all of those kinds of concerns. So I think you may want to consider making this a standing committee rather than an ad hoc committee, and their first assignment could be reviewing the appointment or the selection process and providing recommendations. I think if you do something like that, it actually makes it easier to get started more quickly because you don't have to have a final scope defined once and forever. You'd say, this is first topic, and then upon review, you could give it additional, you can give that committee additional topics to address. And you can even, give it a name like cross-governmental alignment or something like that, just so that it could be not necessarily library specific, but come up with a really clever acronym for it if you do. Thank you.
Janet Winningham. I don't know about you, but it gets a little tiresome to keep hearing about the horrible liberal left, and nobody comes up here and talks about the fascist right for a good reason, because it's not appropriate. And so I would encourage you to, as you are looking at pluses and minuses of the various changes that you are considering, to include, and I trust you will include the ripple effects of some of those changes, like fallout on the effects of how taxing structures will be affected and the effects on the taxpayers and the benefits that having the existing structure affords with joint operations and back office operations and so forth. So not just the top level of pros and cons, differences and so forth, but a deep dive into what would happen if in the ripple effects of the changes that are being discussed. Thank you.
Marshall Schmidt. At the last meeting, I complimented everyone for getting together, and I want to renew that comment. But I do want to address Commissioner Jose's point about power, and I want to remind the Village Council as to what power it has or doesn't have. You will recall in the discussion leading up to this and leading up to the referendum, there was considerable note made of the fact that it is the library board's decision whether to become an independent elected body. And I think that's the law. I may be wrong on that, but I think that's the law. So all of this discussion about, oh, we need this information to make the decision, we need that information to make the decision, that decision is not yours. That is the library board's decision. Now, that being said, the whole concept of a joint board, and I love the idea of a standing committee. I do think this needs to be a standing committee. There are many issues dealing with the library that would benefit from joint input from both bodies. So I think having a standing committee is a very, very good idea. And I would encourage you to consider that concept. My last comment is, this is now the second meeting that I've been to, and there were several meetings of the Village Council that dealt with this. And one of the other points made during those meetings is that the Village Council's resources, as the library board's resources, are very limited. And you guys have a lot of issues that are before you. And we've now spent 2 meetings, and I think productive meetings, but there's been a lot of discussion and a lot of repetitive discussion about a lot of the same issues. And tonight, you were in the weeds spending, many minutes talking about what's power and who's ceding power and who's not ceding power. And I'll return to that point that if anyone's ceding power with regard to the appointment or election of board members, it's the library board that's ceding its power. So I would encourage you to have a standing committee, look broader, look to the big picture. How can you improve the library? Obviously, how it's selected has been raised, and the Village Council does have the power to put a referendum on the ballot. But if you're going to make this a fact-finding body, I'm not advocating to put citizens on it, because I think tonight you saw kind of the problems that are going to arise if you have citizens on the panel, you know, who goes on, you know, what interests are represented. But I would encourage the body, whenever they engage in these proceedings, to take testimony from experts, take testimony from other boards that have gone through this process who can provide input, get input from former library commissioners who are familiar with the appointment process and the consequences of those. Take testimony from everyone, gather all the facts, and then do what I advocated doing last time, is put at the top of the list for whatever question you ask to this panel, what is in the best interests of the community? That really has to be the ultimate question. So thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Laura Kamodolsky, Downers Grove. I want to second some of the things our last speaker just said, and I do want to say I agree with the mayor's description of what the committee is tasked with. I think that was very good. It was pretty neutral, yet explained everything. I think what you said right after that, Matt, was also very good. And yes, the citizens kind of brought this on, but as he said, you can see the problems. You're saying DEI is bad, but it sounds like everyone they want on the board would be Christian and God-fearing. So, I mean, there's not a good way to capture that. You got your work cut out for you. I just want to say thank you for doing this together, and I think that I don't know what to say except for I'm glad you're working out the scope, and I hope you're open to those experts and what they're telling you more about the library policy and how things have been done at other places that explored this. Thank you.
Okay. With that, anybody up here, any of the 13 of us, need to throw anything else out there for one last comment of the evening?
You qualified that by need.
It was intentional. All right, is there a motion to adjourn?
Mayor, I move to adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? We are adjourned. Thank you all.